And it usually comes in the form of my mother describing a situation in which she prays and God does something. Like, this isn't exactly an example she would use, but it's something like this. She's going to the mall, it's raining. It would be really nice if there was a parking space available near the door. Is God the kind of being that will move the Hummer from the parking lot door near the mall entrance to, say, parking lot C, so that my mother could park there and get into the mall without getting wet? And I say to my mother, Mom, don't you think God has bigger things to worry about than whether or not you get a few drops of water on your head on the way to the mall? I mean, poverty, genocide. I mean, you know, there's a big list that God's supposedly working on. And you're worried about, and she responds, well, okay, so, you know, it's not a big thing. But I need to know that God is the kind of being that cares and knows about everything that happens to me and has control over it. Okay. Then I point out to her, what you just said something about you, but it didn't say anything about God. You need to know X, that God is this kind of being. But that doesn't say anything about what God is. About 94% of the people in the United States say they believe in God. When people say to me they don't believe in God, I say to them, tell me about the God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in that God either. Throughout human history, human conceptions of God have vacillated between two extremes. God as transcendent, standing completely apart from time and history, creator, judge, able to move the Hummer to parking lot C. And God as fully immanent. An immanent God stands within the natural order as its principle of order. So the first question about God, if you want to talk about God, is whether or not God is apart from or part of everything that exists. And the second is, if you believe God is apart from, does God meddle? That's the Hummer question. I approach the question of God from a very different perspective. So for me, the question is not whether somebody's sacred scripture talks about God. It's a different question. The question is this: is the idea of God a necessary idea in order adequately to interpret our experience as human beings? It's a very different question. Is the idea of God a necessary idea in order adequately to interpret our experience of the world? Now, when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about God in a different way than a scientist, for example, talks about an apple. An apple can be picked up and weighed and measured, cut into slices, baked in an apple pie, served warm with vanilla ice cream. It can be compared to other kinds of apples and contrasted with other kinds of fruit. The work of science is to describe apples and explain the process by which they change over time and fall to the ground. Theologians pursue a different goal. Rather than trying to explain the physical world, describe it and explain its workings, we try to interpret human experience and account for its meaning. The periodic table of theological elements is laid out in terms of meaning, purpose, and value. None of these can be put under a microscope. Instead, we need to ask what ideas we need to interpret our experience and account for its meaning. In my view, one necessary idea is the idea of God. You may have noticed that I said the idea of God is a necessary idea. I did not say that God exists, nor did I say God does not exist. I believe that God exists in the same way beauty exists, but not in the way that an apple exists. An apple is a physical object, a distinct entity. Beauty never appears to us, but we find the idea necessary in order to account for our delight in the symmetry and form of certain objects and experiences. Sunsets, symphonies. Like beauty, God has to be made manifest through other forms as a quality of our experience. In my way of thinking, the idea of God is necessary to account for two kinds of experiences that otherwise remain unaccounted for. One has to do with the past. When we think of the most enduring elements of existence, we usually think of physical things: rocks, planets, galaxies, and so on. On the other hand, we usually think of the elements that make up the realm of meaning, thoughts, feelings, emotions, experiences, as fleeting and ephemeral. Over time, however, the opposite turns out to be the case. The atoms that make up a given body or object eventually disband themselves and go on to constitute something else entirely. Even so, the experiences made possible by those atoms remain. The question is where experiences go when their physical substrate no longer exists. Where do they go? We have a word for the totality of the physical world. That word is universe. We also need a word for the collection of all experiences in the universe. For me, that word is God. Whitehead calls this the consequent nature of God, suggesting that God is in part the consequence of, and thus constituted by all experiences whatsoever. This idea of God accounts for our sense that experiences matter. They don't just matter to us, they matter, period. Even though no one may remember them or even know about them in the first place, experiences don't simply vanish into thin air. Armchair philosophers often debate the question of whether a tree falling in the woods makes a sound if no one hears it. This trivial question actually raises a serious religious issue. What happens to experiences no one knows about or remembers? Who hears the lonely cry of an anguished soul in the night's darkest hours? Who suffers with a young boy who is abused by his father? Who bears witness to the travesty of an infant girl abandoned on a hillside by her parents to die? What if nobody knows? What if nobody cares? God is the idea, for me at least, that accounts for our sense that just as atoms are never lost in a physical reaction, so no human experience, however sad or tragic, is ever suffered alone or eternally forgotten. As Whitehead put it, everything that happens in the universe, its sufferings, its sorrows, its triumphs, its immediacies of joy, is woven into the harmony of a completed whole. God is the name we give to our sense of an immanent presence that bears witness to everything that happens in life. This is not a guy with a gray beard in the sky. It's a sense we have of a certain kind of experience that we need a name for, but you can't stick under a microscope. For me, the idea of God as refuge of the past is a necessary idea. The other experience the idea of God is necessary in order to explain is the idea of the future. At any given moment, the future can unfold in a number of possible ways. Possibilities have to come from somewhere. This is actually a serious philosophical problem, where possibilities come from. Because until they happen, they don't exist exactly. But where do they come from? Simply put, for me, God is the idea that accounts for our sense that the future is possible at all. Whitehead calls this God's primordial nature, which points to God's role as the beginning of the future. The idea of God also accounts for our sense that the future will unfold in a way that leads toward meaning and not toward chaos. This doesn't always happen, of course. The ancient Greek notion of fate is one I love. It's not a predestined outcome, but it's a tendency of the future to move in a particular way, like the tendency of a plant to grow toward the light. The plant can be turned away from the light, of course, but it will always grow back toward the light. In a similar way, the idea of God accounts for our sense that the future can unfold in a purposive and meaningful way, even though sometimes it doesn't. God is the transcendent source of possibility, what Whitehead called the eternal urge of desire. For most people who say they don't believe in God, these two aspects of the idea of God, immanent witness to all past experience and transcendent source of future possibility, isn't the problem. The problem is the idea that God's a personal being, or to put it more precisely, a conscious being. This is the parking spot by the mall door problem. Is God independent of time and history, able to step in and change things? In a word, the answer is no. In my view, people who accept scientific inquiry as a valid way of knowing, and yet believe God can change the laws of nature, are simply, how to put this, confused. In any event, I'm not interested in building a bridge between contradictory worldviews. I'm interested in an idea of God that children of the Enlightenment can believe in. The question is where consciousness and choice enter the divine picture. The answer is simple. They enter through us, through our consciousness and our choices. Recall that the consequent nature of God is constituted in part by our experience as human beings. It accounts for our idea that our experiences are never lost. The only way God plays an active role in time, in this case, is through us. William Blake was on the right track when he wrote, "Every one of every clime that prays in deep distress, prays to the human form divine." For his part, Blake thought the human form divine described only Jesus. My view is that you and I are also the human form divine. To say that we are the presence of God in this world is not a metaphor. We are the hands and voice of God. God changes outcomes in this world only as we change them. God is not an independent agent, in other words. God is dependent on us. The active agency of the divine life emerges through our choices and actions. This idea of God is hard to accept, partly because it's not personal like Jesus Christ, but partly because it requires us to believe something miraculous, not about God, but about ourselves. It requires us to believe that we are the divine in human form. We bear the burden of the past, and we offer the optimism of the future. Only we can extend the arms of refuge and sound the voice of hope. There is only us. Looking over the cards of your questions last evening, it's clear to me that this is something that a lot of you find challenging and difficult. Not to worry, it is challenging and difficult. But I want to say just a couple follow-up things in light of the questions. One of which is, why use the word God at all? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that I believe that the word God and the symbol of a supernatural power and an infallible source of revelation that it represents is the single most powerful force in this struggle between fundamentalism and pluralism. And I am simply unwilling to let the opposition have full access to a symbol of that power. If we cede to them the word God and basically say, God is what you say God is, we simply think that's wrong. We have ceded the battle as far as I'm concerned. What I want to do is to turn what is now a true-false question into a multiple-choice question. I'm going to say, okay, you have a way of understanding God, but that's not the only possibility. There are other possibilities. There's my way, and there's this other way. And to introduce into the consciousness of people beyond our communion that there are many ways to talk about God and think about God, and that the fundamentalists and biblical literalists don't have a lock on this. Now, concerning the question of people who come into our congregations having been abused, deeply wounded by words and experiences that have to do with God and faith and religion, that's very real, and we grapple with it often at All Souls in our congregation. I guess what I would say is this. What is needed in situations like that is not denial or repression, but healing. And the only way healing can happen is not if anything having to do with a difficult experience is simply walled off from the rest of your life, but if the substrate of that experience, the form of that experience, is redeemed. For example, when someone comes into my office having been in an abusive, intimate relationship, what I don't say to him or her, usually her, is, the answer to this is never have an intimate relationship in your life again. No, the answer is, there's a different way two people can be in relation. The same is true about God and faith and religion. There's a different way to understand God. There is a different way to understand faith and religion and religious community. And I think that what we need to do is redeem those experiences.